Welcome to Teachers Teaching Teachers. It is the 29th of October as October wanes here. I am delighted to get in touch with my colleagues here from Oakland, from Michigan, and from Salt Lake City, and Karen Fessenpower as well, from wherever you are, Karen. Out there in the Southwest. What state do you live in? It is New Mexico, yes?
It's Arizona,
You're
but
in Arizona,
it's 1 mile from New Mexico. So
there you go.
The embarrassment of Arizona often makes me say I'm on the border.
All right. So one of the topics that we have often wanted to get to, and we're going to try to get to, is book talk on youth voices and how kids talk about literature, why they talk about literature, and so forth. I will pose the question as in one particular way, and then I'll ask each of our guests here tonight, and others may be joining us as well, but we'll see, to think about the question. So one of the things we do on Youth Voices is, and I think all of us here are English teachers, so we teach literature. My most uncomfortable question when I go to a party and I say to people that I'm an English teacher is that people say, "Oh, what are you reading?" As if that's the heart of my curriculum. So I just wanted to start the question that way. Like, literature is no longer for me the heart of my curriculum. Like inquiry is, lots of other things are. I think you guys may approach that differently than I do, though. So that's one way. And I will go one more step in this introduction and say this, that I've had teachers, really wonderful teachers, teachers who have kids post on Youth Voices all the time, say, I'm going to do everything you guys do on Youth Voices except my kids don't read, right? So there are a lot of kids who don't read, right? Even to the point where, it's been suggested to me that it's a trigger for kids and it gets them upset when you have them read. I know, you're looking shocked. But so there's that extreme. And then we have a couple of AP literature teachers here with us. Do you guys want to jump in and talk? There's a big range here, but I will end this little diatribe this way. So we ask kids to write about literature. Why? Like, does writing about a book ruin a book, as some people like to say? Does it help kids understand books better? I think on Youth Voices, it's the thing that doesn't get a lot of response often. Like, it just sort of sits there sometimes. So those are some of the problems I'll put out there. Who wants to, Chris, do you want to introduce yourself and see if you can enter this dialogue that I just messed up here?
Sure. Yeah, that was a pretty compelling introduction for people who like books. First question, what am I reading? I must have anticipated your question, Paul, because I actually am right next to a book I'm reading. It's not a literature book for class. It is Disconnected, Youth, New Media, and the Ethics Gap. So, it's part of Project Zero at Harvard's work, Carrie James, who we know through Out of Eden work. But it's kind of an interesting read on her thing is they put scenarios to students and they want to know like what kind of ethical and moral choices they make as they think through their digital work. So it's kind of interesting, what they're finding there.
But describe your literature teaching a little bit, if you would, because you're different than I am in this. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So how it works in my classroom is at the beginning of the year we started with just a list. I have different reading lists. So the first reading list was the usual suspects as far as like, I think it was a list of books that someone surveyed college people and thought that these would be the books that they assumed most students had read. I think there's probably 100 of them. And so I just threw out the list and said, first of all, put a mark by books that you've read. So that was kind of a little self-survey that they did, and that was interesting because they started talking about the books they'd read and the ones they liked and that kind of thing. And then we got into the conversation of what is reading. Like, what if I just read the Cliff's Notes and like faked my way through? Was a question. And what if I just saw the movie, didn't really read much of the book at all? To like kids who are just fanatic readers. So that like, what does reading a book mean? Does it mean like, do I have to read Huck Finn, which I have, but like, do I have to actually read the whole book to understand that like it's a book about slavery and reaching across divides and late 19th century America? I could probably just get that because people have been saying it so long in the things in my circles, let's say. But anyway,
Chris,
then they chose.
I mentioned you teach an AP class, but it's an AP writing class,
It's
not
AP language, yeah, so it's composition. But
okay.
as it turns out, good writers are good readers, and doesn't hurt to be having read a lot of books for your writing. And so then they chose a book, and I gave them, I think we had about a month where they would just bring in this free reading book and read for a chunk of time before we do other things. So every day at the beginning of class, they read for probably 10 to 15 minutes usually. Some days I extend that to give them a bigger chunk of time. Sometimes we can't do it, but more often than not, probably like 85% of the time, we actually start by reading from a book to begin class. And then we read some books together. And so I know, Paul, every year you give me crap about this, but every year around election time...
I don't even have to anymore. Go ahead.
Every year around election time, I can't help it. Like George Orwell has a lot of interesting things to say about, just politics, like, politics in the English language, that essay. And then right now we're looking at, well, just to finish how class looks, and this is a little bit off subject as far as literature goes, but I'll finish. So they have been researching the political issue that matters most to them, and then what they're doing is looking at candidates for elections, looking at their rhetoric and trying to see how their rhetoric matches up with the issues that they're interested in. So that's so the book we're reading now is 1984. So that's kind of a little sketch about how I'm doing literature right now.
Yeah, and so part of the mix here also, as we introduced Don and Joe, is that I think we're all kind of interested in personal inquiry and how that impacts on the books that we're reading, and so that was a really good example, Chris. Thanks for that. Don, do you want to jump in and talk about your teaching's mainly 9th grade, I think, but others as well, and how literature fits in your scheme? And your kids have been posting very recently about books they're reading on Youth Voices.
Yeah, and then it's been interesting in and of itself how they are negotiating how to share information about books after they've read them in the Youth Voices space. And they've struggled a lot with how do I comment on other people's responses. So we've had some fruitful comments in class about that. So my freshmen just finished an independent reading, so they had choice in what they were reading, and that's what they ended up posting about. And so
by choice, you mean they chose anything, or from a list, sort of like Chris does, or
they chose anything that they felt that was interesting, that they would enjoy, that would challenge them, that would be new to them, that they got to pick whatever they wanted. And so they just finished those books, and they did some of their own writing along the way, but they just did their first Booktalk post after they finished. And they had the reading piece has been interesting because before they ever posted, they went out and they were reading and commenting on, or supposedly commenting on other students on Youth Voices before they did their own posts. And so how they actually are choosing to discuss their books in the Youth Voices space, they're sort of struggling through a little bit. Like they're able to talk with each other in a face-to-face, but they've had a harder time figuring out how do I share information about a book when I don't know if everyone in my online audience has read the book or not, and so they're trying to figure out how to spark discussion when it's range and choice for their independent reading. We will also we do read together too, but that's where they're at right now.
In other words, you choose a book together, or one you assign. When you say together.
Yep. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Cool. I mean, you've raised the question also there of when to write about the book, right? Your students have written about it at the end. So, yeah. So then, yeah, it's interesting. Joe, do you want to jump in with some of your thoughts about it's your experience? Yeah.
So I have my seniors in my regular English class just beginning to tackle Native Son. And their initial
And that's
reaction.
a book you've assigned. Yeah.
And that's a book I've assigned, yeah.
Okay.
And they saw 500 pages, they almost fell out the floor. A lot of them just had this, when you say reaction to reading, not a visceral reaction, but just like I was like, wow, you really do not want to read. It didn't matter, I think, any book. It was just this idea of them having to read independently because we won't be able to tackle that many pages in class together. And then I have the other end of the spectrum of readers where I've got a very small AP literature class, and they're tackling 2 novels almost simultaneously, one on top of the other, and that's Things Fall Apart, followed by Cry the Beloved Country. Completely different attitude towards the reading. They're asking for should we just go ahead and finish it for Things Fall Apart, and when do we get to start the next one? So it's really I like that I can see both sides, both ends of the spectrum. For how we approach it, obviously we're doing the theory lenses, but we apply those lenses to everything, any text, nonfiction, fiction, and they're using those same theory lenses in their senior project, analyzing their resources, the same lenses. So we take that approach to our annotations.
Do you want to say a little more about those lenses?
Yeah, so...
I think, by the way, there is somebody else on, and I invited her, but she couldn't make it tonight, but Kara Juharity at Harvest High School in New York City uses the same kinds of lenses as... Awesome. So, and her kids publish a lot. I think that's the main thing they do on the site is they write about books they're reading. But go ahead.
So I choose, like with Native Son, I teach that one every year, and I choose it because of the timelessness of the main character in terms of just the choices he has to make, and so then it allows for one of the practices is daily discussion, and I'm trying to bring in something I just went to a PD about conversations involving moral reasoning, and so where we can then tackle Bigger Thomas and we can tackle Trayvon Martin and Oscar Grant and Michael Brown, and just the kids can I feel like that's what's going to be the most engaging are the conversations, and of course the worry is they'll be able to have a lot of those conversations in the class, like they'll be able to do it and engage, except when we're talking about actually reading the novel. And my worry right now is, yes, I'm going to get a lot of students that are coming in having read the summarized versions online, and so they have to do so much writing work with it. It kind of forces them to have to. So they do annotations. They've got their standard comprehension questions, and then we move into analysis paragraphs, and I'm hoping that those are what they post online are those analysis paragraphs where they'll take a single quote and do a multi-lens approach to it and just try to put complex thought onto youth voices and be able to convey it, and and hopefully there's other teachers on there that I can share my class with. And then I just feel like our district is really pushing academic discussion, and so that's what's going to be a lot of the work within the class. These 30 minutes, there's 15 minutes of table conversation. So my kids sit in round tables. Table conversation, and then whole class discussion, and then back to table conversation, and hopefully that's going to engage them to be able to better do the writing. But I am nervous. Their reaction today made me really nervous.
Say more about the nervousness.
To be real, like the students that we're having, and given that the main character in the novel is African American male, a couple of years older than the kids I have now, the students that were having the most extreme reactions, like head-on desk kind of reaction, and I have excellent rapport with my children. I feel like we can have these real conversations because of that rapport, and that there's that sense of community. But the minute I was saying, I had to turn into a slightly different teacher and say, the expectation is that you will have to read this novel outside of class. It was my African American male students that had the, oh no miss, that's just, no, that's not, we don't, no, that's not gonna happen. And it kind of made me a little bit sad, because I'm like, oh my God, you guys, this is a novel where it'll feel the connection will be so personal in so many respects, and I'm worried that we're not even going to get to that point with some of my kiddos because of this idea that they're going to have to read independently. That just that in and of itself is going to make them they won't do it. But then there will be 75% of them that'll jump right in and realize there is that value of being able to read and do it by themselves and in class, and by themselves and in class. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. I mean, I stay hopeful. I mean, they always have this kind of a weird, but it was just really, I do have more African American male students than I've had before. So I heard it a lot today from all of the periods that I teach, 3 sections. So.
Great, thanks for those. I mean, I think we've kind of put out some of the issues here. Is it Carlton? Do you want to say hello?
Oh,
you look
hello.
very relaxed there.
I am, thank you. I actually stumbled across the Hangout just looking at Plus and found my way in. I found it an interesting topic. I typically do some Hangouts in the morning with a group of an eclectic group of friends, and we were actually recently talking about literature in high school, or grade school for that matter, but we were talking about it in terms of how much influence parents should have or do have in terms of the selection of the literature, and what happens to the teachers when they're trying to have a group discussion where students can learn from other voices, and how is that affected when you have 1 or 2 students that, because of parental pressures, have to select a different book than what everyone else is reading or looking at. But that sounds a little bit off topic. If I can ask, I am curious, you both referred to this concept of lenses and looking at something with different lenses. Is that simply another way of saying a different viewpoint, or does it mean something else that I'm not aware of?
Yeah, break that down a little bit, if you don't mind, Joe.
Yeah.
Starting with the theory that you're basing it on.
Oh, okay. So we start the year where they build conceptual knowledge about literary theory lenses, and the lenses are, we study things from a Marxist perspective, and by Marxist, more like social class and economic power, who has it, who doesn't. Then we go into the feminist lens, and we're looking at gender relationships and character interactions, male-female, male-male. Then we go into post-colonial lens, where you're looking at issues of skin color, culture, privilege, based on race. And then psychoanalytic, we study id, ego, superego, We study mommy-daddy issues. We study how childhood, memories influence behavior. And then we do reader response. So the one that they've been using, activating like most of their life, is the reader response lens. And we do it that way because then it does allow students to be able, it gives them like language and a framework of questions where they not only do a lot of personal examination, then they apply it also to the characters and the plot in literature. So I guess it's a way of talking about the text from multiple perspectives, different into how to read and then what they can then write about and how they develop their analysis. And so different kids will have ones that they master because they just, like I have a number of female students that when it comes to the feminist lens and talking about gender and power dynamics there, they want to talk about it. And so that's a lens that they'll look through.
There's a blending of reader response and the feminist response.
Yeah, blending. Then blending happens a lot. So then you get multi-lens annotations where a kiddo can take like a single piece of evidence and approach it from all these different perspectives and just work with, what the author has stated and then what that all means. Does that clarify?
That's it, yeah. So sort of like you're basically just taking different vertical slices through the material.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Welcome, Carlton. Karen, anything you'd like to add at this point, or
no? I'm just listening.
Okay. So, Joe, I wanted to be clear, and I think, Don and Chris also, your students, these are the same students, these literature students, who are also doing the civic engagement inquiry projects, the senior projects for a whole year kind of thing?
Yeah.
So, sort of going back to the question, because I think it is our question, but I think, anyway, it could go bigger than this, it feels really obvious why you would, if you're doing a research project, why you would put your question up there, let people know what you're inquiring into, the sources you're finding, and your results, and ask people to join you in that inquiry. Why doesn't it feel as easy, obvious with literature? Is that one way to ask the question? Don, was that what your students were asking in some way?
No, I like the question that you're posing, Paul. Yeah, that's exactly it. They were trying to figure out how do you enter into a conversation having different background on a text, and that's what they've been struggling with a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to talk about those things and say, how do we spark conversations about bigger ideas, and then explore it that way. Or some of them tried to approach it with, I'm going to try to get other people to read my book. Some of it approached it from more of an analytical view. So they've wrestled with it. And granted, I think that there's a lot of value in having them post along the way, and I'd like to do that next time. This time we just posted at the end.
Mm-hmm. So, and just to throw in the idea, Christy Kingham, who I worked with this summer and who I think will be on the show next week, has a project that she did with, it might have been juniors, but it might have been seniors too. I think it might have been seniors. And the question was, going back to Chris Sloan, the list that you found somewhere of, these are books you should read before you go to college. The question she posed was, what are books that should be read, quote unquote, do you think should be read before you leave high school, right? And so that became kind of their inquiry project where they were talking about books. So there does seem to need to be some sort of framework like that that we could share in some way. Chris, you were going to say something else though. It was just an idea I didn't want to lose before. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So your question a while ago was like, it seems like it's easier, from my end anyway, the students, it seems like it's easier for them when they put up an inquiry question to get some discussion about it. And I have some examples of students who did something similar with books, and there is no discussion on it. but I think it's a similar, and I'll just put one in the both the chat rooms here, and we don't have to.
But talk about it, yeah.
Yeah, I will. I just wanted to put that in because
Yeah.
I can't talk and paste at the same time. So this girl, you know, she just accidentally picked up Man's Search for Meaning in my classroom, and it wasn't really on the list technically. No, it wasn't on the list. So you know, it starts off. She's got 4 paragraphs there, and she starts off saying, like, I had no intention of actually reading it, but then I got really interested in it. And her last paragraph, to me, seems a lot like inquiry questions that my class comes up with, not always with books. So she
Do you want to read the last paragraph? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this got me wondering, she says, does our capacity to survive increase when we are put in unusual circumstances? Aside from our survival instincts, what changes in us that breaks down our moral abilities and engages in us some superhuman will to fight? Will people who don't endure some hardship or suffering ever find the same meaning within themselves as those who have? While I have only just started reading Frankl's book, I'm hoping to have some of these questions answered. You know, like, to me, that seemed like those are pretty fundamental questions that are pretty interesting to me. And to her, obviously. If you're not familiar with the book, he survives 4 different concentration camps. All his family is killed, and yet he finds meaning in all this, in all his suffering. So she became really interested in that, and I thought, like, maybe it's because it starts off with someone talking about a book that it doesn't lend itself to conversation. I don't know, because to me, like, if that first paragraph or the last paragraph were a post just by itself, I feel like somebody may have picked up on that as far as the conversation goes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I kind of feel like writing is used in literature classes for accountability often. It's like, are you reading this? Are you, like, you know, and you know, the Common Core pressures and so forth are about, you know, proving stuff in a text and so forth. And I'm not sure that leads to conversation, right? So that may be some of the issue. Like, so this girl, like, yes, conversation could have developed around those questions in the last paragraph. But do we know she's reading the book? I mean, what is the purpose of the writing about the book then? Am I worrying this too much?
No, I don't know if I have an answer for that question, but I think that it's about, really, her questions are, one kind of tag I could put on it as far as a research question is she's talking about resiliency. And in the past, like, I've had students who are really interested in resiliency stories and resiliency theory and that kind of thing. So I think it's maybe, you know, there's something about maybe the way that this is framed that you know, didn't get much conversation. But it's also like there's so much stuff on Youth Voices that a lot of things that are really worthy of conversation don't always get picked up, and that's, you know,
that's another bigger issue. But yeah.
But I thought, you know, like, I found a couple of my students' examples where they really are really dying to talk about the ideas that they discover in books. And I think that is different than how we normally expect people to write about books in class. You know, like, it's not an accountability thing. There's another example of a guy who he's just powering through, like, Brothers Karamazov, and he is right now reading War and Peace. He's doing all the Russians, and I'm trying to find his one, and he's really interested in big questions. I'm going to drop just one more in here just to show you.
That's happening right now?
Yeah, because it's really short. But he references another one of his posts. this
So
thing.
What's bringing around in my head, and Joe and Don maybe too, but is like, why is the literature separate from the inquiry?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why aren't those kind of, sorry, you raised you opened your eyes wide there. I'm sorry. But like, is it, or it feels like it is to me, and it is in my class often. But Chris, the reason I question is that you seem like you're giving examples where it's not so, where it could be more connected.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that I have to do as a teacher. But as I was reading through, like as we were talking or getting ready to talk about book talks, I was just looking at students who'd posted in book talks recently,
Which is
and
voices. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And yeah. So in the channel Book Talk on Youth Voices, I thought it was like I come across ones where I think people really want to talk about their books, but they don't frame it maybe as that they want to talk about books, because it is more like I read this. This is what I thought, kind of thing. So it could be the way that they're framing their thoughts about the book. That's not framed as like, let's talk about it. It's framed as like, here's what I think.
Mm-hmm.
So there's probably a lesson there somewhere.
Yep. Mm-hmm. I know this feels a bit tortured, but anyway, Don, what are you thinking at this point?
Well, I was thinking through the question you pose is reading separate from inquiry, and I think I very much don't want them to be. I think that sometimes it's connected well, and sometimes it's not in my classes. Like sometimes I make the connection strongly, and sometimes I don't. And I think it's interesting to me to see how students work through discussion about books, dependent upon. I know I kind of keep going back to this, dependent upon how they perceive their audience. So like my American literature students are reading The Great Gatsby, and they too are using literary lenses. And when they talk together about it, and they talk in discussions, even in an online space, they sort of are thriving with it. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I help them move that into a space that group. So that's sort of what I'm wrestling with. And we recently they recorded small group discussions, and they're starting to analyze their discussions of different groups and sort of see what's going on. And so I'm trying to figure out if they have a space for some work, or even to post some audio conversations about a book, where it's a group of students making a post instead of one, if that would get some movement forward.
Yeah, let's keep popping ideas like that. That sounds good. Karen, do you want to represent the conversation that's happening in the chat a little bit for us?
Yeah, so we were just having a discussion in the other chat about sort of what students see as their purpose for writing on Youth Voices, and sort of what we might see. And I guess my feeling was that generally it's to sort of pursue inquiry and to share ideas with a broader audience and elicit response. And then the question was, how much is it just an assignment? And then the other thought I was having about this topic about inquiry and literature, and just especially reading the post of Chris's student, is I think people might be hesitant to chime in on something if they haven't read the book, if it seems like it's really a discussion about the book versus a discussion about the issues in the book. And I just even wondered in that post if those questions were up front, if that was the first paragraph, and then it went into, I'm reading a book and it says this, maybe people would feel more comfortable responding if it were implicit or explicit that you don't have to read the book to talk about the issues.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Carl. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I appreciate that. Sorry, I didn't really have it well framed before I raised my hand. I briefly read a book recently called A Brief History of Philosophy. And the reason I bring it up is because I think that people are generally, they tend to find patterns. We're very good at finding patterns, whether it be in books or out in nature. But I think especially children have to be made aware that the pattern exists first before they will recognize it somewhere else. And I'm curious in their reading. Um, I'm thinking back to when I was in high school as best I can. Uh, at that time, a lot of times we were given a moral question or an ethical question, a philosophical question first, and then given a book to read to see how the author addresses that particular question. And I'm curious with kids nowadays, with the kids that you're dealing with, is that the pattern, that here's the question, now let's look at an author, or is it more open-ended where we simply say, here's an author, here's a book, and now find the questions in that book that are of interest to you and that you want to discuss? Only because it seems to me that if they are made aware of somebody was reading the Russian authors, he was interested in the big questions. If they're more aware of what those questions are, I think there would be more of a tendency for them to find those questions as they're reading different works of literature. And I'm not sure if there's a specific question embedded there, but I guess more of a statement.
Yeah, to just talk about, to put that post into context, that was when they were doing free reading. So no one else was reading the same book at the time. So he was generating those questions based on his own reading of the text. Yeah. And I guess in general, one approach that I take that's probably frames a lot of what I do in the literature class is trying to make the classics relevant when we read the classics. Like, how do those themes still persist? How do they still play out? So I don't know if I start with me coming up with a question, but I'm wanting them to find relevancy is more my approach.
Okay.
So one of the other things that I think I do with literature is the simple notion of whatever you're writing, you're reading also. So we've been working with personal memoir kinds of writing here at the beginning of the year with kids, and so we wanted them to be reading memoirs and to be kind of have that be infused with that. So that's another kind of approach to always kind of be reading and writing similar kinds of things. But Joe, you mentioned earlier, and I don't want to lose this, that you make connections between Bigger Thomas and Michael Brown and others you mentioned there. How do you do that? I mean,
well, so they start every class with some type of an opening journal, something that's provocative, something that shapes the later discussion. So tomorrow's starter, I guess, I'm still crafting, but Bigger Thomas killed Mary, and what's going to come up is whether or not he was fully in control of himself when he committed this tremendous act of violence. And my students, 90% of whom have PTSD, I want them to be able to access that personal experience, but I feel like there's in the literature, by using the literature and talking about the literature, it gives a level of objectivity to that, to being able to talk about those kinds of personal events, because they can talk about it in the context of Bigger Thomas and whether or not he was in control. When they're talking, what I'm seeing is them actually talking about moments when they were not in control, and they might have done something really stupid, made a decision hastily, and that to me is where, I worry, do they need to read the book to get to that point? And I think part of why we ask those kinds of moral questions, like what Carlton was saying, at the beginning you ask this big question, and then the kids will grapple with it. I feel like when you ask questions that are provocative, that are very connected to what they're already feeling, but you add that layer of objectivity by using it in the context of the main character, that then the kids can actually say, I don't know, I feel like they can speak on it more. And then when it gets to the discussions, like in our Socratic seminars and in our table talks, they have to cite evidence, which then you get the kids that are really savvy that'll read, a piece of the text and make sure they can bring it up in the table discussion. I love those kids. And I also think that also is a comfort, though, when you can cite the text and use that example to prove your point when you're really saying, yeah, if I was Bigger Thomas, I would have killed her too. I'm not about to get caught and go to jail. And so I just that like where I'm at right now with the kiddos is now I'm like really trying to figure out the super moral questions that this book raises, that just as an example, because I think that they already ask those questions in real life. You're just putting it in the context of the novel. These are questions my kids are, they ask this every day. So
it would be great if there was another teacher on, like Chris Sloan, for example, on Youth Voices who was reading Native Son at the same time, right?
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
What difference would that make, do you think?
It would mean that my students would see when they're going to be posting their analysis, and I think to biggin it up a little bit, that part of why posting annotations and posting analysis is important is, and what I tell them and why I say that I love teaching English is because you might never be wrong in English. Everybody can be right as long as you're proving it with the evidence. Like, you can all be correct. And I start at the beginning of the year with that there's many ways for you to be, quote, right about the literature, and I'm breaking down years of people telling them that there's right answers to questions, because everything that is studied in literature with them might have been just all plot, and so I think that having another classroom that's also reading Native Son would mean that my kids can grapple with some of these moral questions in the same way, in a way that's talking about a text. So it's like I'm not having a conversation with you about something really sensitive and touchy-feely, and just because we're both black, we're having this conversation. No, we're talking about the novel, but we're both black. But then our thoughts are, we're connecting on it's a different plane that they're connecting on. I think it would be amazing. Or not. It brings people to get people able to have conversations. I'm just thinking of when my kids would talk to Chris not on literature, to Chris's kids, and how completely different demographics, completely different social class, but they could still have conversations. That's also a piece that my students would benefit from, is hearing multiple perspectives, because I do have kids that never leave Oakland. They do not leave the neighborhood ever. And I think that that's what this would allow them to do, is being able to have dialogues. I mean, that's a fundamental thing we're encouraging, is the promotion of the dialogue. But they're having dialogues about real powerful issues like racism and sexism and killing and violence, but in a space where they can use the text to do that. And I don't know. I also talk about how, my students, like, when you look at, I don't ever want to follow them on Instagram, but when I see some of the things that were posted, when the hashtag if they gun me down, how all these kids were started to post, right? All of these images of themselves doing, being like in their grad outfit and then doing something else. I was lightweight appalled that some of the students, some kids were still posting stuff that was so vulgar that's gonna it's gonna be with them forever. Digital afterlife forever and ever and ever. And I do tell them that, my gosh, when you guys post on Youth Voices these academic analyses of what is weighty literature, some people can't ever get through Native Son, and I do it to laud their accomplishment. I said, you are also creating a profile where you're seen as an intellectual as well. I mean, on a very basic publishing level. So.
Mm-hmm.
Joe, I'm curious if you think having another group of students reading the same piece of literature, Native Son, would that motivate your kids who just feel like they can't read it to read it?
Yeah, I feel like
Really? Wow.
there'll be a few emotions going on. There is a trust issue, like students, like you know, when they first got on Youth Voices, the same students that are having a hard time thinking that they're going to have to read such a novel were also the same ones that were very anti-wanting to comment and start with that exercise. So you know, I see it's the same kids that are having that reaction, and I'm just wondering. I don't know. I feel like they might start to see the relevance of both the reading as well as the writing and putting your thoughts out for a public to hear. And part of me thinks that they are scared of being judged, one, for their writing ability, there's that, but then two, just being judged, period, by people from outside of Oakland who don't get it. And so that's a hurdle. And then I have, like, you know, 90% of the kids that are perfectly, they want to post, they want to publish. But the ones that are having the hard time grappling, that's going to be the ones who lead the conversation. It'll be the richest parts. They are Bigger Thomas. And it's a very scary place when you're that person. And it's interesting that the edition of the book that we have, one of the first comments that was made was how they pointed to one of my students and was like, "Oh my God, this looks just like you." Really, it was a moment today. It was a big moment. Yeah.
So Don, what book do you go to as a whole class eventually, or do you know yet, or is it a series? It's maybe not one book, but yeah, how do you handle that?
My next book, well, my book for freshmen will be To Kill a Mockingbird, and right now my American Lit class is finishing Gatsby. We'll read some shorter pieces and then eventually a Crucible. And as Joe was talking, I was thinking, gosh, I wish I had a group that I knew I could just go out, buy the books and read them with you. But it made me think, are there spaces is there a space in Youth Voices to tackle some shorter texts that are relevant and maybe use Genius that Paul was using earlier and do some discussion that way? Like, my freshmen are reading short stories. Are there some thematic pieces that we could sort of craft and help students get to the point where they're more comfortable talking with one another through shorter texts first?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, yeah. I mean, you know, it's Halloween, and somebody put up the Telltale Heart, right? So, you know, so we could all just sort of gather there and read that together as an example. And that's a quick example, but yeah, I mean, using Genius would be a great idea, I think. And yeah. So I mean, so for example, you know, my students, you know, I have these little 6th and 7th graders, so they're not reading Native Son yet, but they did read. They are reading the first chapter of Black Boy, for example. So they you know, we could have a Richard Wright conversation at some point. So that's a possibility. So there are other ways to connect. Could I ask for like a popcorn ideas, because Joe, I know you have done you've had kids when they're reading Shakespeare do make things, right? Do scenes and or props and so forth. So what are other ways that we respond to literature that we could maybe share too? You want to talk about that project first, and then we can.
Yeah, sure. So it was kind of like, what is that? Iron Chef meets Shakespeare. That was the project, and it was this idea that the students, they could only bring in a grocery bag full of recycled crap. So they had a long list of crap. T-shirts that they had outgrown, shoelaces. Look at the drawer in your kitchen that has a whole bunch of who knows what's in there and dump it in there. and they could come in with this bag, and they had to create the prop that they were assigned, and they had to do it within the one class period. And so it was kind of like this whole maker thing going on, and a whole bunch of just crap everywhere in my class, and it just forced the kids to be able to, one, understand like there are these multiple symbols in the text that have a tremendous meaning. And then when you have to create it, you become like a prop maker and a stage designer. And so there's an element of if you're working with a play, there's something beyond the text. It's not just a bunch of words. It's the performance aspect. And so how do you bring that piece into it?
So what play were they working with?
They were working. I had one group working with Othello, and so they were given that particular symbol, and then they had like 90 minutes to be able to make these pieces. And it also energized the students to want to read the play, because we did this at the beginning, and then I took pictures of them, and then they posted them on their blogs. But it also adds that element of like competition. So when you're trying to read Shakespeare, I mean, I bend over backwards making sure that we build up until they actually want to read it, and where it becomes a game to decode the language. So that's just one of the things that we did with. But I am going to be, in terms of like a native son, the now comment, Paul, that was introduced a few weeks back. I'm going to jump on that. I'm just trying to figure out, I guess, the difference between now comment and Lit Genius, and when to use what, and what's better if we're going to potentially collaborate with other students not in our class. So that's another piece. Yeah.
So what were you thinking of putting on either one of those? A chapter from the book, Joe? Or?
Yeah, so there was the rat scene. I was gonna start with that because we've gone over, I did a guru collection with the rat scene, and that was really cool because we have
slow down a little bit. What was in your guru collection?
Oh, I did. Yeah. I can post it in a sec. What was in it was I wanted them to have reactions to this idea of a black rat, and because that particular symbol frames a lot of what happens in the rest of the novel, and we are, in terms of a literary element, one of them that we're studying is symbolism. And so I put together a one-pager of just images of black rats. I just pulled them from Google. And so that was the first resource. The second resource was a 1-minute video of black rat. And there was a piece where it almost looked like the mother rat was eating her young, but she wasn't. But it just provokes, kids were, especially the ones that had just had lunch, were having a really hard time looking at that. And it was I wanted them to have a very physical reaction, much like when in the opening scene of Native Son, Bigger's mother is screaming and crying. Vera jumps on a bed. Bigger Thomas has to, he beats the thing to death and is yelling the MF motherfucker all over the place. And I wanted them to kind of just get a sense of that space. And what we did then was them being able to do that guru collection. And I was watching their faces, and I said, that's exactly what I wanted to happen. I want you to be disgusted. And then what would it feel like? And so it also, from the Marxist perspective, and they're looking at social class, it kind of hit more home, like, what if you live with something that looked like that? And it was in your home, and it was a constant. It was always, you had rats living with you, to give them a real sense of the poverty. But what's interesting is a lot of students had personal stories involving rodents, and that's because they do live with. But by doing it this way, you're kind of allowing them to, Bigger Thomas they're talking about, but they're really talking about themselves too. So that was one of the into the novel. Yeah, and then like you were saying, Chris, I want to post that rat so that because they're comfortable with that scene now, they've read it 3 times in 3 different ways, that they can now post comments, their annotations online to each other, and then eventually shifting to posting it.
So how do you have them annotate the text now?
So tonight's work for them is they're taking the rat scene and they're approaching it from all 5 lenses. So you have some students that'll pick one quote, beat it to death, and they're going to keep it it's not easy, but they're gonna keep it limited in terms of how much text they're actually gonna work with. And so by annotation, that means that if they have to do one of each, one SAM post, one marks, one psychoanalytic, and one reader response. And some might take different evidence pieces. I pulled a bunch of quotes they could potentially use. They put the focus, they put the page number, they put the quote, and then they put their thoughts. And the way that they put their thoughts is that they answer some of the lens questions that that are already in their notebooks. That we, like I said, we were doing conceptual work with them at the first 6 weeks of school. And so then they're going to come in tomorrow. We'll see where they're at. So it's their first set, and I said, we're going to be easy. We're going to work with the ones you have, and we're going to improve them, or we're going to talk about how you approached it, because I'm trying to encourage them. I don't want to say they're wrong. They're not going to be wrong. It's just more like, how did you do it? And then we're going to look at different students' ways of. So then they're going to go back to the same table of groups they had today, where they started the work, and they're going to be able to talk to just those students. So that's the approach to just getting into the novel. Like, there's a lot. I've done, I think, 2 weeks of just prepping with the kids before they got the novel in their hand.
So without getting hung up in the tools too much, what kind of connection can you imagine, Chris, with this? Like, how long is the rat scene?
It's 5 pages.
5 pages. Okay. So it comes down to, again, kind of like just knowing that that's available to connect to. Like, it wouldn't have to be a whole class. It could be 3 kids who, would really like to connect to that, right? So that's one thing to think about.
Yeah, because I have one student for sure who I talked to Joe about this a couple weeks ago. She's missing her connections with Fremont High School. I don't have her in the same class. I've got her in English class now. So if I told her about this, like a now comment or whatever of this passage, and I think I could get some takers to talk about symbolism with this. And then I was also thinking of, there's this chapter from Black Boy, I think it's Black Boy, and Paul, you guys are reading Black Boy, where the mother kind of kicks him out of the house. He's got to go to the grocery store. I think that's
Yep. That's in the first chapter. Yep.
Yeah. So in just that chapter alone is a nice little narrative of growing up. I mean, it's not a nice narrative, but it's it's like a self-contained little story. So we could do some kind of reading around Richard Wright together and come across some similar themes that way. Because next book for me is going to be Dead Man Walking after 1984. Both of them have to do with justice issues and a lot of things that I think there's a lot of crossover there. So something like that opening thing from Black Boy, I think, would be an easy in for my kids.
Yep. So youthvoices.net/blackboy, all one word, //blackboy. The whole first chapter is there. And one of the things I did a few years ago that's I think is a little bit fun and doable, is that I had kids record their own reading of different sections of the first chapter. So my kids now are like listening to those kids reading the book to each other. So playing with stuff like that, I think, is one possibility. Again, it's youthvoices.net/blackboy. And yeah, my kids, so that the section you just mentioned is there, in there. I don't know where it is, but it's in the first chapter. I mean, one way to think about literature, I certainly think about the first chapter of Black Boy as and I babble about this elsewhere, but as a workshop, really. It's like, here are some ideas for things you could write about too, right? So that's what the literature is in a way, in that case. But yeah. there's all that. So the other thing I thought was interesting is that, I'm sorry I don't remember which school it came from, but there were some really interesting Halloween stories posted on Youth Voices. So if you go to our Narratives and Poems, another channel, there, we could be our own literature for each other as well. So blending this notion of literature and writing, I think, is really an important thought as we go here too. I'm looking up at the clock and thinking that we have probably enough problems out there and a few ideas. Chris, do you want to give some final thoughts and ideas for how you might connect? Let's ask it that way, if I may. Yeah.
Well, part of it is just knowing what each other's doing.
And that's what we're doing here, so that's good. Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah.
I'm on 1984, and we're the next little step is going to be, especially this last week of elections, is looking at language of politicians and the issues, which I think, links to what Joe's doing in her class and what her whole year senior project is, like the issues that matter. And then students are going to write letters after the elections, because sometimes we forget about stuff. Like once it's done, it's like, okay, let's move on to something else. So they're gonna, continue doing research about this issue, and then whoever gets elected, they're gonna write to this person as people who can't vote yet, most of them, with opinions about what they want these people, these newly elected people, to do. So that's kind of in the next little few weeks, and then we're going to be looking at Dead Men Walking, death penalty, justice in America kind of stuff, readings from, letter from Birmingham jail, and a lot of kind of seminal rights kinds of writings. So I'm putting that out there just to let people know this is kind of where I'm going to be through December, if anyone wants to connect that way.
Yep, and Karen, this inspires us to get that channel up again, so that we can go somewhere and see what you're doing. Don, any last thoughts? Thanks, Chris.
My freshmen are wrapping up, while they're working with memoir writing and what are stories, and doing short stories, and then we're going to be going into To Kill a Mockingbird. And so we'll be looking at stories in our country, and then my American Lit class is going to be moving from Gatsby to literary movements and going into Crucible. Crucible would be the justice piece that maybe will overlap a little bit with Chris' work. So that's where we're at and where we're going, but that doesn't mean that, like, anytime, and as I poke around on Youth Voices, I'm excited to think about short text that we can use to help them foster a conversation.
Great, yeah. Thanks for all that. Yeah. Joe?
I'm like Chris. I mean, it's like this is my public plea. If anyone is doing native son or a text related to with an African American male or an protagonist, or in African lit or colonial literature, I would be happy to connect. And then I'm interested to see, Chris, what your kiddos are doing with 1984. We go into Shakespeare and then Brave New World. And that's in the spring. So
Okay, because we'll do Shakespeare too. I can adjust to when you guys do it. So just let me know when you're doing it.
Okay. Yay.
And you know what, Joe? I'm just saying this, and maybe I'll think something different in 10 minutes. But I'm thinking if we could get that part of Native Son up on Genius, that makes the most sense at this point.
Okay.
But that's just one notion. Get that up on the Genius, and then maybe we could have some people connect in that way.
Cool. Okay.
Carlton, any last thoughts? And then Karen, you get last thoughts.
No last thoughts from me except to say thank you for letting me sit in and learn a little bit tonight.
Thank you. Karen, any thoughts?
I really like the idea of pulling the inquiry questions out of the literature and maybe asking students to do that, and then doing some work on Youth Voices around the central question or issue, and maybe students bring evidence from different literature that they're reading. Because I do think it's, it's always really hard to have people coordinate reading schedules, and it's great where you can do it, but I think that might be a nice way not only just to address the logistics, but also to make the inquiry more front and center.
It sort of addresses Don's students' questions about audience there, right? So yeah, you're going to be talking to people who aren't reading the same book, so how can you make your comment bigger in some way about the book?
And Joe's point of bringing real evidence, but it doesn't have to be from the same book that everyone's reading.
Cool. Well, thank you all. We'll be here again next week. Teacher Teaching Teachers is a broadcast of the World Bridges Network at edtechtalk.com. Dave Cormier and Jeff Lebo help coordinate all that. And thank you all for your help here tonight and helping us think about this. Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Night.
Night all.